Hey, this is Michelle and welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. Today's episode, number 24, is the true final part of the Conquest series of videos. I know I said in the last video was the last in the Conquest series, but this one belongs to the series because it deals with the aftermath of the Conquest. This video covers the life of the French under British rule and the 1763 Treaty of Paris. Now, before we start, let's take a quick moment to review what we saw and heard in the last episode. In summary, we learned that New France was outgunned, outmanned, and outplayed, that 140 British ships stretched for 80 kilometers down the St. Lawrence River with an invasion fleet of 13,500 men and a strike force of 9,000 soldiers. That on September 13, 1759, British General Wolfe was able to sneak troops up the cliffs of Quebec and scale them up to the Plains of Abraham, coming up behind the city of Quebec. We also learned that both French General Montcalm and British General Wolfe died during the battle, and that 5 days later, Quebec City surrendered. And after that, Montreal surrendered on September 8, 1760. We learned that New France had fallen. Okay, now we're ready to start this episode on the 1763 Treaty of Paris. And just to be clear, there was more than one Treaty of Paris. Yeah, there were two treaties called the Treaty of Paris. This one, in 1763, deals with the end of the 7 Years' War between Great Britain and France. The later Treaty of Paris in 1783 ended the American Revolution between Great Britain and the United States. Okay, first, it's important to note that France was not really affected by the loss of New France, but because of what the Canadiens saw happen to the Acadians by the British, the Canadiens were concerned about what would happen to them. Actually, the treatment of the Canadiens ended up being completely different than that experienced by the Acadians. The Canadiens were not deported, and the average Canadien lived pretty much the same life as before the conquest. But it was somewhat of a disaster for the ruling elite of New France. The military and its leadership were gone, as were the French governors and their administrators. The British actually encouraged the French to stay. The British no longer had to worry about the French military as they had been wiped out in North America. The Canadiens themselves were not a threat. But another reason for the French staying was the British military governor, James Murray. You may remember him from the last episode as the British officer who was left in charge of Quebec City after it surrendered. Governor Murray did not ban French laws, customs, or institutions. Canadiens were allowed to keep their possessions and property, and they were allowed to continue practicing their religion as part of the Catholic Church, whereas the official government-approved religion was to be Protestant, led by the Anglican Church. With the French military and French elite gone, this left the Catholic Church to play a major role in French-Canadian society, and would do so well into the future of Quebec. Then on February 10, 1763, France signed away its empire to the British with its endorsement of the 1763 Treaty of Paris. France handed over to British 1. Canada, that is the St. Lawrence heartland; 2. The rest of Acadia, including Cape Breton and PEI; and 3. Any claim to the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes; and finally 4. French Louisiana. That left France with only 2 small islands off the coast of Newfoundland, Saint Pierre and Miquelon, which are still territories of France to this day. But this didn't end the problems for the British. This time it wasn't the French, but the French allies that were the problem, specifically the First Nations peoples. The British did not have any treaties with the natives of the interior, and their resentment grew as British settlers moved in and took over old French trading posts. The Seneca of the Iroquois Confederacy were the first to show their disagreement as many British settled on their lands. A medicine man known as the Delaware Prophet wanted the First Nations people to return to their traditional ways, to reject the ways of the whites and the brandy trade that caused them so much grief. He wanted to drive the redcoats from the region. The Ottawa People's War Chief, Pontiac, agreed and allied himself with the Prophet, the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, and the Seneca. The British frontier exploded with violence, with more than 2,000 settlers being massacred and 400 soldiers being killed. With the exception of the Fort of Detroit, all forts west of Fort Niagara were captured. The violence lasted 2 years, and Pontiac finally signed a peace treaty with the British. Pontiac made it clear that the British would be considered as tenants only, not owners, and could only occupy the trading posts as such. Of course, the British agreed, but had no real intentions of keeping their word. And with that treaty, the Native alliance fell apart in favor of peace. The treaty and following royal proclamation of 1763 established boundaries and organized Britain's colonies in North America. Key points included: 1. The St. Lawrence region of New France became the newly created province of Quebec, with James Murray continuing on as governor. 2. The province of Nova Scotia was created and expanded to include what remained of French Acadia. Nova Scotia now covered the entire maritime region, with the inclusion of Cape Breton, PEI, and New Brunswick being added to the British Nova Scotia. And 3. A defined approach to native lands. To better manage British expansion, settlement was prohibited west of the Appalachian Mountains. The interior was reserved as Indian territory and placed under the administration of a Superintendent of Indian Affairs located in London, England. His job was to arrange land treaties with the First Nations peoples prior to land settlement. This is a very critical point affecting the future of Canada, so I'll repeat: to arrange treaties before settlement. As a result, this proclamation still has huge impacts that remain with us today, for good and bad. So, according to the terms of the proclamation, if land was not given up by treaty, then the land still belonged to the First Nations peoples, even today. This proclamation forms the cornerstone of many First Nations land claims today, although its validity has been challenged in the courts many times. And although this verbiage is not part of Canada's current constitution, it is referred to in Section 25A of the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Statement of Interest says, quote, "Any rights or freedoms that have been recognized by the Royal Proclamation of October 1763, end quote. This means that this issue will remain part of our legal landscape for a long time to come. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 also tried to make Quebec more attractive to English settlers by promising to introduce British law and restrain the French seigneurial system of land ownership. But few English accepted, as Quebec was colder, remote, northern, and French-speaking. But a handful of English-speaking merchants did set up shop in Montreal, which was still the main hub of the fur trade. This now brings us to a change in spelling and pronunciation. Up until now, I have referred to the French-speaking population as Canadiens, with an E. Now, the English-speaking merchants of Montreal came to be called Canadiens, with an A. Now, of course, tensions began to rise between Canadiens and Canadians. The Canadians in Montreal were a small but vocal group of merchants, but unfortunately for them, the British Governor Murray had grown to like the Canadiens and sided with them more often than not. Governor Murray ignored the part of the Royal Proclamation that promised English law and assemblies, and he supported the role the Catholic Church played in the lives of the habitants. He allowed French laws and customs to be followed in the courts. The Canadiens complained all the way to London, and Governor Murray was recalled. He was cleared of any charges, but never returned to Canada again. Well, that's it for our look at the 1763 Treaty of Paris. Let's summarize. France signed away its empire to the British on February 10, 1763, with its endorsement of the 1763 Treaty of Paris. France handed over to the British Canada, the rest of Acadia, any claim to the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes, and French Louisiana. This left France with only two small islands off Newfoundland, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. The English then landed in a 2-year war with First Nations peoples, but eventually signed a treaty with them. The Royal Proclamation created the province of Quebec, with James Murray continuing as governor. The Royal Proclamation created the province of Nova Scotia, which was expanded to include what remained of French Acadia. And the Royal Proclamation created the defined approach to native lands. We also learned that British Governor James Murray was a pretty decent guy who seemed to favor the Canadiens. Now please stay tuned for the next episode, episode 25, where we jump into the American Revolution, part 1, and its relationship to Canada. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up. And hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.